Have you ever walked into a room and completely forgotten why you went there, only to stand still, confused, waiting for something to click, or remembered an event clearly, but not how it felt? The laughter, the fear, the sadness. It's all strangely absent. This kind of forgetting is subtle. It doesn't look dramatic. You still function. You still work, talk, show up, but pieces of your inner life feel oddly muted, as if someone turned the volume down years ago and never turned it back up. You might notice it when people talk about your past and you nod along, knowing the facts but feeling disconnected from the person they're describing. Or when you look at old photos and think, I know that was me, but it doesn't feel like me. And the most confusing part? It's inconsistent. Some memories are sharp, others feel foggy, distant, or completely blank. Entire emotional chapters seem missing, not because nothing happened, but because remembering them feels oddly inaccessible. Most people assume this means something is wrong with them, that they're careless, distracted, getting worse with age. But what if this forgetting isn't a failure at all? What if it's not about memory, but about protection? Because sometimes the mind doesn't erase experiences. It simply learns that feeling them was once too much and quietly decides not to go there anymore. When people notice these gaps, their first thought is often fear. Is something wrong with my brain? Am I losing my memory? But what's happening here isn't memory loss in the way we usually imagine it. It's not decay, it's not damage, and it's not a sign that you're broken. It's a survival response. In psychology, there's a term for this: dissociative amnesia. Despite how clinical it sounds, the idea is simple. When emotional overwhelm becomes chronic, when feelings pile up with nowhere safe to go, the brain adapts, not by erasing experiences, but by separating them from conscious access. Think of it less like a hard drive failing, and more like a protective lock being installed. The mind learns, quietly and efficiently, that fully feeling certain moments once came with too much cost, too much conflict, too much loneliness, too much danger. So instead of reliving those emotions, it tucks them away, out of reach, not gone, just inaccessible. This is why you can remember what happened, but not how it felt. Why facts remain, but emotional texture disappears. And crucially, this response isn't a flaw, it's intelligence under pressure. Your nervous system made a calculation at some point. Staying present hurts more than pulling back. And so, it pulled back just enough to keep you moving forward. The forgetting isn't random, it's purposeful. It's the mind doing what it does best when it senses threat, protecting you long enough to survive. Most people don't stop feeling because they choose to. They stop feeling because, at some point, feeling wasn't allowed. Not in a dramatic way, not always through yelling or obvious cruelty. Often, it was quieter than that. It was the sigh when you cried, the impatience when you were scared, the subtle message that your emotions were inconvenient, excessive, or out of place. Maybe you heard things like, "Don't be so sensitive," or "You're overreacting." Maybe no one said anything at all, but no one came either. And slowly, you learned something important. Expressing how you felt didn't bring comfort. It brought tension, dismissal, or silence. For a child, that's not just disappointing, it's instructive. Children don't have the option to leave. They adapt instead, and the adaptation is rarely conscious. It's a quiet internal shift. If my feelings create problems, I'll keep them to myself. So the sadness gets swallowed, the anger gets tucked away, the fear never quite makes it to the surface. From the outside, this often looks like maturity. You become easy, independent, low maintenance, People praise your strength. They admire how little you seem to need. But inside, something else is happening. Emotions don't vanish just because they're unwelcome. They go underground. And when feelings are repeatedly pushed out of awareness, the nervous system learns to dampen not just expression, but access. Over time, this isn't limited to specific emotions. The system generalizes. It becomes safer not to feel deeply at all than to risk feeling something that won't be received. And that's where the forgetting begins. Not because the experiences weren't meaningful, but because fully remembering how they felt once carried a cost your system couldn't afford. So the mind does what it was trained to do. It protects by muting, by distancing, by slowly turning the volume down on the inner world. To understand why this happens, we have to move out of the mind for a moment and into the body. When the nervous system senses threat, it has one priority: survival, not clarity, not self-expression, just getting through. Most people are familiar with fight or flight. But there's a third response that's far less talked about and far more relevant here. Freeze. Freeze occurs when the system detects danger, but doesn't see a safe way to escape or push back. The body stays still. Energy turns inward. Speech and emotional expression become difficult. Not because there's nothing to feel, but because feeling too much could make things worse. In this state, the nervous system learns containment. It learns that staying quiet reduces risk, that staying numb prevents escalation, that staying functional is safer than staying present. So the system adapts. Attention narrows to what's necessary. Routines, responsibilities, tasks, the things that allow life to continue. Meanwhile, anything tied to intense emotion, grief, fear, even joy gets deprioritized, not erased, but placed outside conscious reach. This is why people in survival mode often describe life as mechanical. Days blur together. Time feels strange. You're doing everything you're supposed to do, but you don't quite feel there while you're doing it. From the outside, it can look like resilience. From the inside, it feels like distance. And this is the crucial part. The nervous system doesn't make these choices based on logic. It makes them based on safety. At some point, pulling inward became the best available option. And once that pattern is learned, the body keeps using it long after the original threat is gone. Not because it wants to limit you, but because it hasn't yet learned that it's safe to stop surviving. One of the strangest parts of this experience is that memory doesn't disappear completely. It changes shape. You can recall what happened. You know the timeline. You can list the facts. But when you reach for how it felt, there's nothing there. It's like holding a photograph with all the colors drained out. You recognize the scene, the faces, even yourself. Yet the emotional weight that should be attached to it is missing. The moment feels distant, flattened, almost borrowed from someone else's life. This is the kind of loss most people never name, because from the outside, it looks like remembering. And from the inside, it's easy to assume this is just how memory works. That maybe you were never that affected, that maybe it wasn't that important. But the absence of feeling isn't neutrality, it's disconnection. Many people describe it the same way, looking at childhood photos and thinking, I know that's me, but I don't feel like I'm in that memory. Or rereading old messages and being surprised by the intensity of emotions they no longer recognize as their own. Sometimes it's even more subtle than that. You might struggle to describe yourself emotionally. What do you like? What hurts you? What matters most? The answers feel vague, intellectual, rehearsed. This is because emotional memory isn't just about recall, it's about embodiment. It lives in the body, not just the mind. And when the nervous system learned that feeling was unsafe, it didn't only dim pain, it dimmed access. Over time, this creates a quiet kind of loneliness. Not the loneliness of being alone, but the loneliness of being present without being connected. Of moving through your own life, as if there's a thin layer of glass between you and your experience. And the hardest part is this. Because nothing looks obviously wrong, this loss often goes unnoticed, unmourned, unacknowledged, yet it's real. Not because you lost your memories, but because you lost the felt sense of being inside them. What often surprises people is that this isn't just an internal experience. It doesn't stay contained in memory or mood. It follows you quietly into your relationships. When emotional disconnection becomes familiar, it starts to shape what feels normal in closeness. You may not notice it at first. On the surface, you can be caring, attentive, even deeply loyal. But underneath, something subtle is happening. You might struggle to track how someone actually makes you feel, not because you don't care, but because your system learned long ago not to register emotional impact too clearly. This can show up in confusing ways. You stay in relationships longer than you should because you can't quite access how much something is hurting you. The warning signals are faint. Discomfort feels muted. By the time you realize you're unhappy, you've already adapted around it, or you find yourself drawn to people who feel emotionally distant, unpredictable, or hard to read. Not because it's healthy, but because it's familiar. Their lack of emotional availability matches your own internal landscape. There's less pressure to feel deeply when the connection itself is faint. Boundaries can become difficult here. If you don't fully feel your anger, your disappointment, or your grief in real time, it's hard to use those emotions as information. You might intellectually understand that something crossed a line, but emotionally, it doesn't register strongly enough to prompt action. This is how old survival patterns quietly repeat. Not because you're choosing unhealthy relationships, but because your nervous system is still oriented toward minimizing emotional risk. It prioritizes stability over aliveness, predictability over depth, and so connection becomes something you manage rather than inhabit. The painful irony is that many people in this state deeply want closeness. They want intimacy, understanding, emotional safety, but the very adaptations that once helped them survive now make it harder to stay present when intimacy asks them to feel, not because they're incapable of love, but because love requires access to feelings they once had to put away. There's a paradox here that most people never realize. The harder you try to stay strong, the more your inner world fades. Strength, as many people learn it, means control. It means staying functional, not breaking down, not needing too much. And for someone who learned early that emotions weren't welcome, this kind of strength feels responsible, mature, necessary. So you push through, you keep moving, you stay productive, you tell yourself it's not that bad, and on the outside, it works. Life continues. People rely on you. You get praised for how well you hold it together. But inside, something else is happening. Every time you override a feeling instead of acknowledging it, the nervous system receives the same message. This isn't safe to feel. And over time, it listens. It learns to pull you a little further away from your internal experience. This is why forgetting increases during periods of high pressure, prolonged stress, or emotional overload. The system isn't failing, it's doubling down on what it knows. Staying strong becomes staying distant. Staying composed becomes staying disconnected. The irony is that this version of strength often comes at the cost of presence. You're there, but not fully. You're capable, but not deeply engaged. You survive, but you don't quite arrive. And here's the part many people miss. Nothing is wrong with you for functioning this way. This strategy once kept you safe. It allowed you to endure when you couldn't afford to feel everything. But what protected you then may be limiting you now, because strength that never softens eventually turns inward and quietly erases the parts of life that make it feel real. When people begin to notice this disconnection, there's often an instinctive response. I need to remember, to dig, to analyze, to force clarity out of the past. But healing doesn't begin there. In fact, trying to remember too much, too quickly, often does the opposite. It signals to the nervous system that danger is approaching, that old emotional territory is being entered without enough safety. And when the system senses that, it doesn't open, it tightens. This is one of the most misunderstood parts of healing. You don't reconnect with yourself by chasing memories. You reconnect by creating conditions where feeling is allowed again. That starts very small. It might be noticing a flicker of sadness without pushing it away, letting yourself feel irritation instead of explaining it down, pausing long enough to sense your body before moving on to the next task. These moments seem insignificant, but to a nervous system shaped by survival, they're radical. They communicate something new. I'm not in danger for feeling this. And, the final, there's no need to relive everything. No need to uncover every story. The system doesn't heal through intensity, it heals through consistency, through repeated experiences of being with emotion without consequences. This is why compassion matters more than insight. You can understand your patterns perfectly and still remain disconnected if the body doesn't feel safe enough to soften. Healing, in this sense, is less about remembering the past and more about updating the present, teaching your system that it no longer has to brace, that it doesn't have to mute itself to stay safe. And as safety slowly returns, something unexpected happens. You don't go looking for memories. They begin to find you gently, spontaneously, in moments when your guard is down, not as floods, not as breakdowns, but as quiet reconnections, because the system opens when it trusts the ground beneath it. When the nervous system begins to feel safer, memory doesn't come rushing back all at once. It doesn't arrive like a dramatic revelation or a sudden emotional flood. It returns quietly, often in ordinary moments. A song you hadn't thought about in years, a smell that brings a feeling before it brings a story, a sudden awareness of sadness, or warmth, or longing, without needing to explain why. This is how emotional memory re-enters, through sensation before narrative, through feeling before meaning. For many people, this can be confusing at first. You might feel something strongly and wonder where it came from. The mind wants context. It wants a clear timeline. But the body moves differently. It releases what it's ready to release when it's ready. What matters here is not forcing interpretation. The return of memory is not a test you need to pass. It's a sign that the system no longer has to keep everything contained, that it trusts you enough now to allow access, and that trust builds slowly. Each time you stay present with a feeling, without shutting down, each time you choose gentleness over control, each time you let yourself be affected, even briefly, you reinforce safety. Over time, memories that once felt unreachable may begin to feel closer, not because you chased them, but because the distance is no longer necessary. The lock doesn't disappear overnight, it loosens, and with that loosening comes something more important than recall, a sense of continuity, a feeling of being inside your own life again. Not perfectly, not all at once, but enough to recognize yourself not as someone fragmented or broken, but as someone whose mind did exactly what it needed to do until a safer way became possible. For a long time, your life may have been organized around one goal: getting through, not falling apart, not needing too much, not slowing down long enough to feel what was never welcomed. And that wasn't a failure, it was adaptation. What you experienced wasn't weakness, it was intelligence under pressure. A system that learned how to protect you when safety wasn't guaranteed. Nothing was lost. It was held at a distance, waiting for a time when you wouldn't have to survive quite so hard. The shift from surviving to feeling doesn't happen in a single moment. It happens quietly, in small choices, in pauses, in allowing yourself to be affected without immediately pulling away. And when that happens, something subtle but profound changes. You begin to feel more inside your own life. Your reactions make more sense. Your boundaries become clearer not because you force them, but because you can finally feel where you end. This is what coming back to yourself actually looks like. Not dramatic, just real. If any part of this video felt familiar, if it put words to something you've been carrying quietly, you're not alone. This channel exists to explore these subtle psychological patterns that rarely get named, but shape so much of how we live and connect. If you want to continue these conversations, consider subscribing, and if you feel able, share in the comments. What part of your experience resonated most with you? Sometimes, being heard is where the healing truly begins. Thank you for watching.